Well, good evening, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome. And hardy souls who pay attention to the fact that the storm doesn't come till tomorrow. But we may have some storm tonight here, who knows? I have to first start with the fire safety announcement. So there's no fire drill planned for this evening. So if we hear an alarm sounding, please follow the signs to the nearest emergency exit so we go out here and pretty well back the way you came. So, we're especially delighted to welcome Lord Bob Kerslake to present the Chancellor's Lecture for 2022. The Chancellor's Lecture is the university's foremost annual public lecture. For those of you who are regulars, and I see lots of you, then previous lecturers have included Lord David Willits, Dame Wendy Hall, Lord Peter Hennessy, and Lord Michael Bishard. It does sound as though we're going for a royal flush of lords and dames. But people who've got somewhere in life have had interesting journeys and have something to say. So tonight, Lord Kerslake will be discussing trust in government. And he has a wealth of experience in governance at both local and national level. He started his own career in local government within the Greater London Council, handling transport and finance. He became Permanent Secretary for the Department of Communities and Local Government in 2010. He was also head of the civil service from 2012 to 2014. And during his time in working with government, his roles have included Chief Exec of the Homes and Communities Agency, the National Housing Regeneration Agency for England, Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council, the fourth largest in England, London Borough of Hounslow as Director of Finance, and a further 7 years as Chief Exec. Today, Lord Kerslake is chair of a wide number of organisations, including Peabody. I'm especially fascinated to learn more later about Peabody. You know how you hear titles, and I once at Edinburgh University was introduced to a statue who was the Peabody of the East. And I always thought that was the grandest title to have, to become the Peabody of the East. Aspirations. But Peabody owns and manages more than 67,000 homes across London and the South East, and has more than 16,000 care and support customers. His other roles include Chair of Sheffield Theatres, Chair of Sheffield Hallam University, Chair of the Centre of Governance and Scrutiny, Vice President of the Local Government Association. I don't know how he finds time to do all this, because in addition to this, he chairs the UK 2070 Commission, an independent inquiry into city and regional inequalities in the UK, set up to conduct a review of the policy and spatial issues related to the UK's long-term city and regional development. I have the privilege and pleasure of being part of an advisory board with Penna, chaired by him, and know him to be strong, fair, direct, who demonstrates his integrity through deeds, not words. So I know we're in for a really interesting evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Lord Kerslake.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this annual lecture. I do think it is a great event that you have here. You clearly had some illustrious speakers before me, and I hope I can match up to their contributions to your events, really. I think it's something that every university should have, and I think I may well borrow the idea for Sheffield Hallam University and get back. It's always interesting to think about this issue of titles, and people ask me, what would you like to be called? Is it Lord Kerslake or Lord Bob Kerslake or whatever? And I say, look, just call me Bob. It's only my children I insist on using for the title. If you knew my children, you'd know just how unlikely that is. But look, it's also great to have your kind introduction, Renee. You kind of feel your life is flashing before you when people do that, actually. All of my career has been in the public sector. I'm a passionate believer in the importance of the public sector, both local and national, and its contribution to the well-being of this country. And my time in central government was both fascinating and challenging in equal measure, I'd have to say. But I guess I'd say the time I had as Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council, where we really led the renewal of a large part of the city, was perhaps the most fulfilling in terms of achievement. And I am a passionate believer in the importance and value of local government in this country, which is often undervalued in my view. Now, one of the particular challenges of my time in central government, which you alluded to, was that I held down two roles at the same time. That's to say, Permanent Secretary at DCLG and Head of the Civil Service. My boss at the time at the DCLG, Department of Communities and Local Government, was one Eric Pickles, who used to call me Two Jobs Bob. That was his phrase. Now, he was very pleased with this joke, I have to say. So it kind of was wheeled out very often in meetings. Now, since stepping down from the civil service, I've taken up what is often called a portfolio role, a euphemism for doing too many things with too little time. And my wife now rather accusingly says I'm not 2 jobs Bob, I'm 8 jobs Bob. Now, I haven't quite had the heart to say to her it's a bit more than 8, really, but who's counting? But just thinking of Eric, it reminded me of my first encounter with Eric Pickles, who I really liked working with, I have to say. When he interviewed me, he took me up to his office, which he was very proud of the fact it was in the oldest part of Parliament, going in St Stephen's Tower. Now, anybody who knows that tower knows it's quite a small tower, and the lift that takes you up is quite small as well. Now, there was Eric, me, and I've lost a bit of weight since then, I have to say, pretty rotundo, and his principal private secretary, who was also on the heavy side, let's put it kindly. And all three of us got into this lift, and this is my first interview with him, by the way. Horror of horrors, the doors didn't close. And I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to do here? And he said to me, I shall never forget this, he said, I think you're going to have to get closer to me, Bob, than you entirely feel comfortable. So I did. The doors closed and I went up. I was never sure whether that was a physical reference or a metaphorical one. But we got on well, and I have a lot of regard for the kind of work he's now doing, actually, in many ways. Now, one of the new roles that I took on since stepping down was to be chair of the Board of Governors at Sheffield Hallam University. I think a great and vital institution in Sheffield that has set out its stall to be a leading applied university. And as part of that role, I took on a job as chair of the UPP Commission into the civic role of universities. And what we sought to do was to explore whether that civic role, which was the foundation stone of many universities, still had relevance and potency in the modern age. And we found that it did, and we found that many universities, and I've heard this from Stephen this evening of some of the things you're doing, that role was alive and well. But what we found was a lot of really great initiatives, but not a strategic approach to that role. And I'll say a bit more about that later, because actually I think there's a role, the civic role is part and parcel of the university getting trust with its community, really. So let me come back to that. Now, I was going to make the subject of this lecture the civic role, but I changed my mind, actually, and decided to talk about trust, because I felt it was an urgent issue to be debated and needed to be out there as an issue of discussion. And I'm going to say some fairly direct things. You said I was direct, Rennie, because I feel very strongly this is a moment we should be reflecting on the issue of trust and the importance of it. There's no doubt in my mind that the importance of the issue has risen rapidly in recent times. And you can, if you haven't already, I would recommend you read the speech of the former Prime Minister, John Major, to the Institute for Government. A powerful statement that I'm going to quote from in a moment. I was also this week, by coincidence, because my daughter works at DLA Piper, at a speech by the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer. And the central theme of his speech was the issue of trust. That's where he started from in his speech. So it seems to me it has undoubtedly become an important and vital issue to be debated. And I think we know the reason why it's risen up the political agenda. And clearly Partygate is a significant part of that, the collection of events that took place over the last year or so during periods of lockdown. Now, I'm going to resist the temptation to talk about Partygate first and instead focus more on the wider questions of trust in government and why this is so vital to a well-functioning democracy. Just let me start though with talking about what we mean by trust, because we often use the word, but what do we mean by it? The dictionary definition of trust is to believe that someone is good and honest and will not harm you, or that something is safe and reliable. We trust in it. And I think the key thing here, relevant to our discussion tonight, is that it is about a relationship between two parties. There is a mutuality in trust. Government would like us to trust them, and the government also needs to trust us to do the right thing. At a very basic level, trust is about telling the truth. But I think it goes well beyond that, because it's also about telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. In government terms, it's about being open and honest and not being, to use the phrase coined by Sir Robert Armstrong, or Lord Armstrong I should say, economical with the truth. The public expect us to tell the whole story honestly. But I think actually trust goes further than that still, really, because for government to establish trust, for the public to trust government, they have to do more than simply tell the truth and the whole truth. People have to believe that the government will do what they promise to do. They also have to believe that they have their best interests at heart, and they also have to believe that that government will act to make their lives better. So it goes beyond simply truth-telling. Now, these are hard tests. We should recognise this for any government to meet. You may make promises in your manifesto that you sincerely believe you can deliver, and then circumstances change. COVID, of course, has been a massive challenge to the current government and would be to any government. And those prevent you from delivering the things that you promised to deliver. I think even without, if you like, these big disruptive events, the experience I've had in government, and this is of all parties, I should say, is that there is an intrinsic optimism bias in politicians. They believe sincerely that if they say something will happen, it will happen. Most of us in life know that it isn't quite like that. And the consequence of that optimism bias is that they very often, and again I make this point of all parties, overpromise and underdeliver. So that is another challenge, I think, to that wider definition of trust. And of course, in terms of well-being, circumstances beyond the immediate control of a government, such as the global financial crash in 2008, may lead to a fall in people's security and their quality of life. So even on that test of can we improve people's lives, it's not always straightforward that government can do that. And then of course there's another dimension to government and to politics that we should remember, that in any healthy democracy, and I emphasise in any healthy democracy, you will have an opposition that will challenge the achievements and sometimes the integrity of the government. That's what they're there to do in their role as the opposition. So however well a government think they've done, however much they feel that they've met their manifesto commitments, there is another group of people who will be saying quite loudly, we don't agree, we dispute this. And I say all of this because it's really important to set the context of trust in government and some of the challenges that go with it if you are in power. And I think for this reason, if you like, this higher test of trust that I've talked about and the contested nature of politics, that it is almost inevitable that trust in central government will generally be lower than other public institutions. I think that just goes with the territory. And this is true, in fact, across not just all parties in power, but all countries as well, all democratic countries. The OECD does a regular survey of trust in government, and their 2020 survey found that on average only just over half of people across all the countries they surveyed trusted their national government. That compared with 71% who trusted their healthcare system, 68% who trusted their education system, and 78% who trusted the police. We may later on have a conversation about London, but in general, those institutions are both valued and trusted ahead of central government. It's also worth saying in passing that surveys consistently show that there is greater trust and confidence in local government than in central government. And I think this is just one of the compelling arguments why we should be a less centralist country and devolve more. You'll forgive me for saying that as Vice President of the Local Government Association, but I think the case is strong. The almost inevitable reality that trust in government will be lower than other public institutions and will move up and down according to the economic circumstances at the time might lead people to a view that government and indeed the public shouldn't worry too much about levels of trust, that it will move up and down and we should not think of it as an issue worth spending time on. Indeed, academics historically have said that, some of them. I have to say that I profoundly disagree with that view for three main reasons. Firstly, as the OECD put it so well in that 2020 report, trust in government is the foundation for the legitimacy of public institutions and a functioning democratic system. It is crucial for maintaining political participation, the engagement of the public, and social cohesion. So it's not just a byproduct of a healthy parliamentary democracy, it is central to that healthy democracy. We should absolutely have this clear in our minds. And if you wanted, if you like, evidence of the point, you can look at what we've seen in recent years, the rise of the so-called strong men, and they're all men across Europe. Whether we talk about Putin in Russia, or Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, the story is the same. And of course there are many reasons why they came to power in their countries and behave as they do, but I think a loss of trust in government and a dysfunctional government has been a major factor in that. Democratic parliamentary government seems to me to be increasingly fragile in this world. It seems to me less obvious that people will move that forward march towards democratic parliamentary government will continue. And so we shouldn't, and John Major said this in his speech, take it for granted. We should not think that because it's here now, because we all believe in it, that it will stay that way. So that is my first reason why we should be concerned about trust. The second reason that we should be concerned about trust is that even before Partygate, it has been falling quite dramatically. The 2019 British Social Attitude Survey by the National Centre for Social Research found that just 15% of respondents said that they trust the government either most of the time or just about always. This was the lowest figure for 40 years. If you go back 40 years, you find that that figure about people trusting most of the time was 40%, fallen from 40% to 15%. But I think equally worrying is the number of people who almost never trust the government. That figure has tripled to 30%. That's quite a big test. They almost never trust the government. Extraordinary numbers. And in his speech last night that I was able to listen to with Sir Keir Starmer, he quoted a survey that said that an extraordinary 2/3 of people think that politicians are likely to lie to them. Now, I won't do a poll this evening on that point, but we just need to hold that number in our mind. That's an extraordinary and I think shocking figure. Of course, it goes up and down. If you look at the years, it's gone higher some years and lower others. It went up during the early part of the pandemic because people wanted to trust in government, and rightly so. But the underlying trend is inexorable. You cannot deny that figure in my view. And if you look at the United States, the position is, and if anything, more stark. A paper by the consultants Deloitte found that public trust in the federal government has been declining for decades and now stands at just 20%. 20% of people in the US trust the federal government. And it's also true to say that just as in the UK, although states and local governments are typically higher in their levels of trust, those have also been declining. And I think it begs the question for me about at what point does the fall in trust reach a level where it impacts on the effectiveness of government. And I say that because whilst governments have the power to compel us to do things through laws that we pass through Parliament, whether we want to do them or not in some instances, much of government has to be by consent. Any politician would say that, I think. You cannot simply run the country through laws and coercion. And that consent in turn relies on there being trust, which is increasingly not there. That brings me on to the third argument for the importance of trust. And it is the wider issues and challenges that this country faces ahead. And if we don't tackle them, we'll undermine the country. And let me take you through some of those really. They're things that existed before the pandemic, and the pandemic, if anything, has made them more acute and challenging in my view. The first is that productivity has remained stubbornly low in this country, again across political parties. It's not a one-party thing. But as I have found in the report I did, the UK 2070 Commission, the gap between the highest performing parts of the UK, London and the South East, and the rest of the country is the largest of almost the largest of all the developing countries, or the developed countries I should say. We did a survey, or one of our academics did a survey, and found that out of 30 countries on a basket of 28 indicators, so not one indicator, 28, the UK came 28th in terms of regional disparities. That's sort of Eurovision Song Contest levels of performance. So we have a low performing productivity, and we have massive inequality as well in this country. And in some of the communities, the so-called left behind communities, there is a sense of powerlessness really, and despair. And I think it's that agenda which the government have picked up in the Levelling Up white paper. And I think it's an agenda that needs to be owned really and promoted across the political spectrum. If we move on to another area beyond economic productivity, the challenges to our public services, and particularly health and care, are quite acute. The government has increased spending in taxes to fund the growing demand, but without societal changes in the way we live, this is unlikely to meet future needs, and the long-term projections on this are truly startling. We have to ultimately accept and need to change the way we live our lives if we're not to see that become an almost unsustainable position. And that in turn requires the most difficult thing of all, changing behaviours, the hardest thing to do in any situation. And that brings me on to the third big challenge. I could have come up with others: the green agenda and zero carbon. Now, the public and private sector will invest in achieving zero carbon. And that's clear now, and I think there's a lot that is already going on that is really important. But it can't just be achieved by big investment from the public and private sector. If you just think about the retrofitting of our homes, and our homes are 20% or more of the energy that we expend in this country, you can see that that's not going to be possible just by big spend by government or by simply imposing it on people. It will be disruptive. It's bound to be for all of us. And it can only happen if the public have joined in that process, if they are active contributors, co-partners, if you like, in the delivery of that big, important agenda of zero carbon, and not just recipients of government advice. Now, the common feature of those three challenges, these enormous challenges we face as a country, is that they can only be achieved with common endeavour between government and its citizens. They're not capable of being legislated, they're not capable of simply having money thrown at them. They require a partnership between government and society to make them happen. And I think the challenge of achieving that common endeavour is made harder by the circumstances we face on trust. If that wasn't the only challenge we face, you might say that's big enough. But I think we face another challenge in many ways, and it's not about necessarily trust between government and the public, but trust between ourselves. Why do I say that? Well, I think we can all see the rise of social media and the impact of social media. And one of the consequences of social media is it results in what might be called communities, bubbles if you like, or closed communities of people whose truth is defined by a set of people who very much think like themselves and who receive their information from sources that are people who think like themselves. Regardless of whether that truth is an objective fact, they believe their truth and they're in a different world to other people who have a different truth. If I take my personal comparison, one of the things I learned from my father, who used to regularly read The Guardian, but he always bought two other papers, at least on a Saturday, The Times and The Telegraph. And he did that because he didn't support the Telegraph's views necessarily, but he felt it was important to have different views and perspectives to the ones he might have held himself. I do the same. I have all of the papers on my iPhone now, of course, and religiously read them all, including the Mail as well, by the way. And I think it's important you do, because that gives you that different set of perspective. It resists the temptation to inhabit a closed world. But social media takes you in that direction. There's no doubt about that. And we can see the future, if you like, if you look in America, and the division between those who support Trump and his team and those who don't. And it is such an acute division that some commentators, serious commentators, have raised the question about the future political stability that might occur in the US. So we have, if you like, challenges in their own right that require the cooperation and collaboration of the public with government, and we have challenges that risk pulling us apart as a country and losing that ability to have common perspectives and common viewpoints. But I don't want to paint an inevitable picture of gloom here. And we kind of know we can make this work when we think of the response to COVID. We know we can get common endeavour because we did. So this isn't mission impossible, but it is going to require effort. And I think unless we recognise that, whoever is in power is going to struggle with the delivery of the big responses that we need. This brings me, I think, neatly on to the issue of Partygate. And I was asked earlier about had it had any impact. Wait, let me just give you some numbers. In July 2021, 40% of the public, on an average of polls, expressed approval of the Prime Minister. That was down from a very high figure of over 50% at the start of the pandemic. And I spoke about that earlier. So it was lower, but still I think a respectable figure at that time. Roughly the same number of people disapproved. Roll that forward to January of this year, the approval rate had fallen to 25% from 40%. The disapproval rate had risen to nearly 60%. That is a staggering change in the public's perception. I'm sure there are other things that have impacted on that, the cost of living crisis and so on, that we know about. But I think anyone looking at it would say that the single biggest cause of that shift in approval must have been Partygate. I think there's no other way of looking at it in my view. Now this is, I think, a really extraordinary thing because it defies the conventional political wisdom, certainly of many people in Westminster, that the public aren't really interested in what goes on in Number 10 or indeed in Whitehall. They're really focused on what government's going to do for them and how they're going to help them improve their lives. So this is all froth, the Westminster bubble as it's often called. Another argument that's made, in my experience, is that really we shouldn't take this too seriously. A Conservative government was elected in 2019 by a big margin. People knew what Boris Johnson was like, and they had, to use the phrase, priced in his more flexible approach to the truth. But I think the reality of Partygate was different in a way that I think we've not seen on any other issue that I know about. And we need to ask the question, why is that the case? Now, politicians of all parties aspire to be what's called relatable in the jargon. What does it mean? Well, it means that the public, if you like, can relate to them in terms of what's going on in their own lives. So what they say, what they do, connects to their own lives, lived experience is the phrase. So relatable is a critical ambition of all politicians. The second thing that's really important to politicians, again, of all political parties, is what's called cut-through. The ability to have an issue cut through the complex noise and the multifarious communication channels that exist and land with a member of the public. So cut through is a big test of an aspiration. Now I think we can say that Partygate was both relatable and had cut through in spades, but most certainly not in the way that the Prime Minister would have wanted. Why do you think it had that effect? Well, I think it was because people could directly relate it back to what they were doing in their own lives at the time and the sacrifices they were making. And the most painful of those sacrifices was the things they weren't able to do with their family. And I'm sure everyone in this room would have examples of that. Not being able to attend a funeral, not being able to visit loved ones who were in a care home or in hospital, not being able to celebrate new arrivals, new children. That was my experience, new grandchildren that I didn't see. And many people felt a sense of guilt, actually, and it's a phrase that others have used, that they couldn't do these things, but they stuck to the rules. They said, this is painful, I feel guilty that I'm not doing this, but I will stick to the rules. And the anger they had for those was because those at the very highest level appeared not to have followed followed those rules, and it was palpable. Now, in the area of post-traumatic stress disorder, we talk about the issue of trigger events. Those are events that pull you back to the trauma that you experienced. And I'm sure there's people in this room who work in this field. I think Partygate was a trigger event for many people. It immediately took them back to what was a traumatic point in their personal lives. And I think that is the reason why this has had such a potent effect on the country, beyond anything that I have seen in my personal career. And I think the anger was compounded by the way they felt that the Prime Minister was handling the emerging stories. And here I will quote Sir John Major in his coruscating speech at the Institute for Government. He said, "Brazen excuses were dreamed up. Day after day, the public were asked to believe the unbelievable. Ministers were sent out to defend the indefensible. In short, people were made to feel like they were fools." And that's, I think, an added dimension to why people felt the way they did. But I think in a way, the most concerning statistic I saw on this was that people were disgusted with what happened, but the majority felt that those involved would not be held to account. The polling is very clear on this point. And I think that actually is a serious issue about how people responded to this event. And as I speak tonight, the jury's out as to whether they will be properly held to account. We don't know yet. Now, following the publication of Sue Gray's update report, I was asked to write a piece, actually two pieces for The Guardian and The Independent, on how civil servants might see this issue. And I know there are very senior people who were both in the civil service and were a civil service commissioner. And I think in truth, the bulk of civil servants would have felt the same way as the general public. It's a little known fact that the bulk of civil servants don't work in Whitehall. In fact, the bulk of them are outside of London, really. They're across the country delivering service such as welfare benefits, collecting taxes and so on. Prisons, of course, are civil service prison officers. So for them, there was no connection back to Number 10. They just experienced the same experience as anyone else. But I do think there was an added sense of disappointment, given the core values that civil servants sign up to: integrity, honesty, objectivity, impartiality. And trust me, as someone who's head of the civil service, they do sign up to that, and in my experience, they do live up to them. I can't say every civil servant does, but most of the ones I dealt with did. And so I think this was an added dimension to their feeling about these issues. And I couldn't give you the number of people who, subsequent to that article, have spoken to me, former civil servants, and said we shared the views that you expressed in that piece. Now, three questions arise from me about where we are now. The first is this a passing issue, like the so-called Barnard Castle incident with Dominic Cummings? Will it become a source of humour, a source of jokes? It's now one of the best tourist sites in the country, I think, Barnard Castle. Will people, if you like, move on from their anger, is the first question, I think. The second one is, will it have a lasting impact on the Prime Minister's standing and indeed trusting government, the issue I want to talk about this evening? And the third one, and this is the most difficult one for me to say something about, is this Prime Minister and this government different from those that have gone before? Well, on the question of the lasting effect, I think it's too early to say for certain. My personal view is that it probably has changed the public's view of the Prime Minister, and that whatever comes next in the actions of the police won't change that. So I think it will be sustained as an issue both in terms of the Prime Minister and people's view about government. The next question is this Prime Minister materially different from his predecessors on this? And I'm afraid I think that he is. There is, to use John Major's words, a brazenness with which he and some of his government, and I say some, have disregarded the rules and the agreed standards. I think this brazenness is evident in a range of issues, amending in the awarding of contracts, on patronage and appointments, on the unlawful proroguing of Parliament, and the holding to account of ministers for their poor behaviour. And I cite as an example the Priti Patel case, where there was a quite clear report that found bullying, but no sanction followed. And I have to say, I fear that this is a pattern of systemic dishonesty and indifference to the standards that predates Partygate. This has been picked up and commented on by a number of political commentators, but I think only became clear to a wider public with Partygate. Unless anyone think that my view is motivated by party or political animus, or because I supported Remain, an argument that's been made, and we left the European Union, I would just invite you to ask yourself whether we would be in this position now if Theresa May was still the Prime Minister, or indeed any of her predecessors. I don't think we would. I think something material has changed. Last year, a commentator who is generally considered to be on the conservative side of thinking, but also an independent thinker who I happen to know and regard, called Peter Oborne, wrote a polemic, which I think was quite prescient. It was called "The Assault on Truth, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and the Emergence of a New Moral Barbarism." And in that report, he assembles a weight of evidence in support of his argument that this Prime Minister is different. He recognises that all previous Prime Ministers were capable of being devious, shock horror. And he has been a very trenchant critic, I should say, of Tony Blair's role in the erroneous use of evidence to support the Iraq War. Nobody has been more trenchant, I think, than Peter Oborne. But he does see Boris Johnson as a marked departure. And I think it's worth quoting from his book. Standards of truth-telling collapsed at the precise moment Boris Johnson and his associates entered Downing Street in the early afternoon of the 24th of July 2019. Before this moment, those engaged in public life could join in the national conversation regardless of what political tradition they hailed from or which party they supported. Afterwards, they couldn't. This is because before July 2019, however strongly they disagreed with one another, there was a common standard of factual accuracy on which people of goodwill could agree. No longer. That is a very powerful statement. And when I read his book, I thought he'd gone a bit over the top, if I'm honest with you. As things have subsequently developed, I begin to wonder about that. Now, I've talked a lot about the importance of trust, and I've talked about my serious concern over its decline. The question is, what is to be done about it? Now, for the longer term, the OECD report that I referred to earlier provides, I think, quite a good guide to what a programme of restoring trust might look like. They identify 5 main drivers of trust in government institutions, and they set out the priority actions that are needed. Firstly, responsiveness, where the responsiveness, where we need to identify and recognise the importance of both regulating and providing good services. So responsiveness is about the service that people receive and whether it meets their expectations. Secondly, they talk about reliability, where the aim should be to anticipate change and protect citizens, very relevant to current times. Thirdly, integrity, but the need is to use power and public resources ethically. Fourthly, openness, where public bodies need to listen, consult, engage and explain. Fifthly and finally, fairness, where government should aspire to improve the conditions for all. I think that's actually a pretty good list. I wouldn't disagree with any of them, and if I was writing a programme to restore trust, I'd include them all. But I think there are some more immediate priorities for action now that should be considered. Firstly, we need to establish arrangements for upholding standards that are more independent than they are at the moment. If I tell you that there was much reference to Sue Gray's independent report, and I have a huge regard for Sue Gray, in truth, she was commissioned to do the report by the Prime Minister, for the Prime Minister. It reported to the Prime Minister, or would have reported if we'd had it, and he would have made the decisions in what it said. We can't, under any kind of construction, see that as an independent process. I think the same issues apply to Sir Christopher Gite, someone I also have a lot of time for, in his role as well. And I'm a strong supporter of the Committee on Public Standards in Public Life, chaired by another peer, Lord Evans of Weardale, former head of MI5, where he argues and recommended in his most recent report that we should take forward increasing independence for those bodies that uphold standards. I think he's right about that, and I think the committee's right about it. Secondly, this is a controversial point, I suspect, with many of my former civil servants. We need to look again at how we can strengthen the Freedom of Information Act. Tony Blair said it was one of his biggest mistakes. I disagree, actually. I think we need to have that ability to force information out of government. And if that information is uncomfortable, so be it. You might say, how does that improve trust? Well, in the end, I think it does, because I think people believe, in the end, that there will be ways in which trust can be established. Now, the Freedom of Information Act has uncovered some very serious examples of public service injustice, if you like. But I think governments and institutions, I'd add to that, have found ways of frustrating it. Anybody who sought information under Freedom of Information will know that, how long it takes, how often you don't get the answer to the question you're asking. And that's why, and almost no senior civil servant would agree with me on this, actually I think it should be stronger and not weaker, because of my passionate belief that it will aid a more trustworthy society. A third proposal I would make, this is one in a way debated last night with Sir Keir Starmer, was I would enshrine the Nolan principles: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership in statute for public bodies. Of course there'll be a challenge of defining them. There are for the civil service values, which are in statute. But I think it would reinforce the power of those really incredible standards that were established under Nolan. Those are 3 examples, if you like, my starter for 10. There's more, I'm sure, and it'd be good to hear from you about what you think. But I have to say, and I don't enjoy saying this, that I think unless there is a fundamental change in attitude by the Prime Minister to these issues, or I have to say, a change in the Prime Minister, I doubt whether any of this will move forward. It will fall on stony ground. And I think that would be a tragedy for this country. So let me just finish on, I think, a brighter note. Universities and the role they can play in building trust. I was privileged to chair the Civic Commission. What we found was that we can have an important and powerful role in building trust with communities. People like universities. Our polling showed that they believe they're a positive asset. But what we found is when you tested them about why they think they're positive, not everybody could come up with a clear-cut answer. And in fact, those who were in social classes D and E were less clear about the benefits than those in A, B and C. So that was, if you like, the starting point for our piece of work. How could we systemically build greater trust across all communities? How could we build a sense in which they could all see tangible benefits from their university? And I think that's why I'm a passionate believer in the civic university agreements that are being promoted by many universities across the country. And I think we can play our part in building greater trust at local level with the public, regardless of whether they have actually been to or are part of the universities itself. Just to give one example, brilliant work being done in many universities, including I think at Sheffield Hallam, to work with children to get them to raise their sights in deprived areas to come to university. And that, I think, weaves them into the future, if you like, of higher education in a way that we must think about. So, to end, trust matters. It matters hugely. It matters beyond the so-called Westminster Village. It's falling, and it has continued to fall for a long period. And that makes a huge difference, and there is a real risk that if it falls further, we will lack the capacity in government, whoever's in power, to do the big and difficult things that we need to do as a country in the decade ahead. And if Partygate has done anything positive, then I think it has opened us up to the importance of this vital debate, and I hope we can continue it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you ever so much for that. A hugely, hugely important and relevant topic for all of us. Let's go straight into questions and discussion, if we could. And I think rather than just sort of acting as a postbox, Bob, are you willing to take questions?
Yeah, sure. I have said to the people doing the microphone that I'm going to choose someone up here and someone down here. Just
we do have some roving microphones.
Really. Over here, there's a question here, I think, colleague there, if that's okay. And do come back with questions and challenge me. That makes it a more interesting evening. Here we go. Thank you very much.
So I think it was the gentleman up there first, and if in asking a question or making a comment you could introduce yourself, that would be very helpful to you.
Good evening. Yes, my name is Wilson, Michael Wilson. Do you believe the way we fund political parties has an effect on the trust in government?
Gosh, that is a big question.
I was thinking there's a lot of Chinese and Russian money around.
Well, look, I think there are challenges in how we fund political parties in this country. We must accept that. On the whole, there's been a reluctance for the state to fund political parties, as happens in some other parts of Europe. For the Labour Party, the issue has been do the trade unions overly dominate its policies by their funding. For the Conservative Party, it's been the issue, as you've alluded to, of private donors. And I think rather than move to a state model, and I think there is a debate to be had, I'm not sure I'm persuaded by it, I think the crucial thing is transparency, that we absolutely know how money is getting to parties and who's giving it to them and what flows from that, if anything, what has flowed from it. Because if you don't have that, there'll always be a view. And by the way, I think, again, regardless of party, we have to take seriously the issue of Russian influence abroad and their desire to influence the political climate in countries. And if anybody doubts that, I would invite you to read Christine Bellam's book. I don't know if anybody here has read it, on Putin. It is a remarkable book that forensically, she's a former journalist with the Financial Times, identifies how and where and why Russia has moved out from their country and sought to influence other countries, including the US including the UK, and we would be naive if we didn't recognise the threat that that creates. So I think you're raising a good question. There's a serious issue here. I think the right answer is transparency. I think the right answer is to not be naive about the fact that it can happen here, because we don't think it's happened before. I think that's how I see it. But have I gone that extra step to say we should move to state-funded parties? I'm not sure, to be frank. Question here, I think, colleague here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kerslake. An interesting lecture. Thank you very much indeed. I'm David Croysdale Appleby. I'm chair of the Royal College of Physicians. So you might expect my question might be to do with the coronavirus pandemic. And I just wondered if you could reflect on whether you believe that trust in government has increased or decreased with their handling of the pandemic.
Yes, it's a good question. And I think certainly in the early period of the pandemic, the evidence suggests that people wanted to trust and did look to government to lead on this. There has been, as you know, a big debate about whether the decisions were taken, the right decisions were taken at the right time. And I've been very strong in saying we needed to get the public inquiry going sooner rather than later to investigate those issues. So I think in an early period it did help in trust, and I actually think it helped not just in trust in government, but helped trust between ourselves. You hear extraordinary stories of communities that work together to support those who are most affected. I'm sure you've heard them as well. Absolutely extraordinary, and it brought us closer together as communities in many ways. So I do think it had a positive, in a really weird way, a positive influence on trust. But I think there were points along the way where that trust started to fray, not as much as in other countries, but certainly with some level of loss of trust. And I think, in a way, that's the sort of reason why Partygate, as it's called, was another reason why it was so, if you like, significant in its impact, was the fact that people had trusted, had done the things that they were asked to do, even if they didn't always agree with them, even if they didn't understand them. Some of them took a while to understand. They did trust government to be doing the right thing and follow, generally, not everybody, but generally. So yes, I do think for a period it helped with trust, and I think that level of trust, both between ourselves and with government, helped us manage the pandemic better than we otherwise would have. A couple of questions over here.
Hello, I'm Ruth Dooley. I'm the chair of She First MEP. My question though revolves around the role of media in trust in government, and the balance between not just social media but also the mainstream media, and whether the balance between freedom of the press, self-regulation, regulation and censorship, whether that balance has got a role in how government is trusted.
Yes, again, a very good question. On the whole, I believe that we need to kind of value our national media, actually. And I say that because they're at risk, actually. The financial model now is hugely challenged. Very few of them make significant profits. And we would be a poorer country if we lost our national media. And I say that as someone who hasn't always been given the friendliest of reporting by them. My love of papers, as I talked about earlier, wasn't reciprocated in every occasion. But I nevertheless passionately believe in the importance of a free press and worry that it's diminishing. And it certainly has already diminished in local government, in local areas. Local papers are very often a shadow of their former selves. So I take Sheffield Many people took the local paper instead of the national paper. They bought it at the factories when they came out of work. That's all gone. You know, the readership is way down, the journalistic capacity is way down. And I actually think that whilst I might argue about the way certain issues are reported, I don't always agree with the views expressed by the columnists, I nevertheless think we should encourage and support a free media in this country, and all of them play an important role in that. And if you don't like one, read another and see how the two compare, is sort of my view. Where I have a different view, and this was a debate we had in the House of Lords, was I think there's a difference between me, politicians, and we have some in the room today, who I think are, within reason, open to that challenge and criticism. Where it becomes an issue, and we all know about the Molly Dowler story, is where ordinary public, people in the public, if you like, are picked out and damaged by the way the media handle a story. And that was why I said that issue needed to be looked at, and indeed met with a number of the key players in the newspaper industry to talk about it. I think they have taken it seriously, or more seriously. The other example I would quote was when I did, on behalf of Andy Burnham, the review of the response to the Manchester Arena bombing. And I didn't actually have press on my list of things to look at in that review. But I did look at it, and why did I do that? Because victims told me about their experiences, and I shall never forget the story of one young lad who sadly died in the bombing, whose parents were waiting all night and then had gone to the police station to wait to be told in a way that he wasn't alive, and then a reporter came to the door of their daughter and said, we understand your brother is dead, what do you have to say about that? We won't know which paper did that, it might not have been a UK paper. And that wasn't the only example. And I think that sort of behaviour has to be beyond the pale for newspapers. There have to be standards that they adhere to. And to be fair, the people I met at the most senior level absolutely understood that. So I'm a passionate believer in the importance of free press, even though it's not always kind to me, but we can't allow it to behave in that sort of way with ordinary members of the public. And that's the challenge, because do you want more regulation to prevent that, or can you see self-regulation? All things being equal, I think we should try for self-regulation, but if it doesn't work, we need to return to the issue. So, a question behind you, and then I'll come to the front, if that's okay.
My name is Adam Oliver, I'm a local resident. A fragile government is one that can't put up with a vocal opposition. We've seen demonstrators being charged with riot recently. For the first time, I don't know how long, but I know maybe someone like the Solicitor General would know when it was last done. And restrictions being imposed or proposed to be imposed on the right to demonstrate. Isn't that another way that trust will be lost, not enhanced in government?
I agree, and that's why I didn't support the late amendments that went into the bill and why they were defeated in the House of Lords, actually, I think. We do need to have a right to protest. It can be extraordinarily inconvenient to us sometimes as citizens, but it is a core part of our democracy that people can protest, not in a way that they are violent or threatening, of course, towards individuals, and we've seen some of that with MPs, again, of all political parties. But the right to protest is a fundamental right, and in the end, it will damage trust. If you're an autocracy in Russia, maybe you can just keep the lid on it for indefinitely, but not in a functioning democracy. You have to allow that ability to protest and demonstrate, I think. And there was a concern, and I know this wouldn't be everybody's view, that the changes that were being proposed would curtail that in a way that would be undermining. So I share your view that however inconvenient, frustrating it can be, we do need to keep open that right to protest. question here, and then, sorry, I beg your pardon, I missed you. Do you want to do go first, yeah, and then
Thank you.
come back?
Hello. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoyed the talk very much.
Thank you.
I'm also a citizen of Cheltenham. What I'm concerned about is that I don't think things are going to change, that as much as you would like them to, unless we have some sort of a disruptor type person, an unpopular person, arguably a Dominic Cummings or something like this, it's just not going to change, in my opinion. Recently I had occasion to contact Lord Sicker, who I'm sure you know, and it was regarding the shocking behaviour of banks in this particular instance, and he replied to me within 2 hours, and we entered into some dialogue. I was very grateful, and we shared a lot of the same views. The point he said was that he'd raised many of these issues that we discussed in the House of Lords, serious issues, and then the next question was, well, Lord Sicker, what happened after you raised these issues? Nothing, sadly. So, from your perspective, no disrespect to you whatsoever, when you raise important issues in the House of Lords, make a valid point, what happens?
I might ask Rennie to answer that question. But it's a good question, and do you know I oscillate on this? Sometimes I feel that we are just a talking shop and we're making no impact. And then something happens and there's an extraordinary speech that shifts the mood of the House and government changes on something, and then you think actually we do play an important role. I think it needs fundamental reform, the House of Lords, myself. We've never quite confronted the issue, do we want to carry on with an appointed House of Lords or have an elected one? We've never sorted that issue out. And unless you sort that issue out, you can't make the reforms that it needs. It's too big. There are too many people there, as I'll be blunt about it, favours rather than what they can bring. We have to be honest about that. Everybody knows it, so I'm not saying anything that people don't know. Political favours I'm talking about here. And that dents its authority, in my view, amongst the public and therefore with government. They kind of think they can sometimes just brush it aside. But just occasionally, like the recent voting on the police bill, they voted down some amendments that couldn't be reintroduced because they've been brought into the Lords. And that was a power, that was an impact. I vividly remember the debate around universal credit, which was an extraordinary debate, packed. I don't know if you were there really, but it was an extraordinary debate. And the Lords supported the amendment, and then the Chancellor didn't seek to force the issue and bring it back, and that change was adopted. So it does have an impact. And I get your point. Sometimes it doesn't have enough of an impact, and I can see that, and I can see sometimes that the government doesn't take it seriously enough. But I still think that unless and until we properly reform it, we need a second chamber that can, at its best, challenge government. Basically, that's how I feel.
Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know, really, would you share that view?
Yes.
Other questions? Here, sorry, and then behind.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Nicola Young. I'm Chair of Council at this university, so I understand some of the issues that we have in our exciting lives. I suppose my question is, I very much enjoyed your talk, but I find myself sinking into a slough of despond. This is not new. I seem to remember watching a programme on the BBC 3 years ago where the Prime Minister was, not Prime Minister at the time, but was asked about trust in politics, and the answer came, well, of course, trust is very important in politics, and the entire audience burst out laughing. This is, to go back to Darius Guppy, go back to the so many instances of it. How deep does the taint go? we see things that would have been unthinkable, and I think in the States as well, you know, the invasion of the Capitol building, unthinkable. And we're seeing the same sorts of things here, not quite to that extent. But you know, where is the counter push? And it's actually a very similar question to the previous one. Where do we get our hope from? And what can we do
Well,
with it?
it's a good question. I think, as I said, there's been a long-term decline that goes across political parties in trust. I've also said that there are kind of intrinsic things that create issues of trust for government, almost whichever government they are and however hard they are trying to succeed. So we shouldn't lose sight of that, I think. But I'm naturally an optimist. I think, in my experience, most MPs want to do good. Most of them are decent and honest people, again, of whatever political party. And so I think if we were to have a programme of raising trust, and if we looked at how other countries have done it, as I referred to, I think we could make a difference. But the first thing we have to do is genuinely accept that there is an issue here. The first step to changing things is to admit it exists. That is my honest view. And yes, it's gone on before. Of course, there was a hotly contested debate about Iraq and whether the Prime Minister lied to us, as we all know. But for the reasons I said, I think we're in a materially different place now. And I accept that's a hard thing to say. I thought long and hard about putting it in my speech. But I think unless I say these things, unless I speak truth, if you like, then we won't acknowledge the fact that there is an issue here. And maybe it will be sufficiently felt that it gets either changed by either the Prime Minister changes his approach or the Prime Minister changes. And I do think, so I'm an optimist, I do believe we can, if we have a will to it and mind to it, change this issue. I could give you a long list of other things I think should change as well, but I won't tonight.
Thank you. I just wanted to say something back to Nicola, if I may.
Yeah, go on.
Where does it stop? It has to start with us. It has to start not just what are these people going to do about it, or those people going to do it, or the public. It has to start with every one of us saying, I will not put up with this, I will challenge it. I appreciate a disruptor could be helpful, but then that polarizes. But each of us in our own way have to be able to say to our MPs, to our local councillors, to whoever has some connection, this is where I stand on this, what are you going to do about it? And where were you when some of these things happened, Owen Paterson and other things, and what did you do to try and make it different? So I'm an optimist, but I also think I have a responsibility, as does everyone here, to do something.
That's a good point. I suppose you say we all have to be disruptors in some way, don't we? That's a fair point.
I did do.
Okay, we've got a question here and then over here.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed your talk this evening, and I think I totally agree. Trust is absolutely fundamental for us to move forward, and I think to reassure Rennie, I'm Lorraine Dixon, the Head of School for Health and Social Care, and to reassure Rennie that I'm often a disruptor, and I write to my MP very regularly. I think for me, trust, integrity, that ability to say sorry, as you were saying earlier, is really important. But the other bit is about the evidence base. And as a university, it's fundamental that we provide that evidence base behind what we're doing, and we're constantly challenging the evidence base. But I guess, what's your thoughts around this distrust of the evidence base that it seems to have arisen, we've seen particularly around what happened with Donald Trump, and to a degree I think whilst there's been some good examples of following the evidence base within COVID, that I think we're kind of veering off at times and not being explicit about how we use that evidence base. I just wonder what your thoughts are around.
No, I think you're raising an important issue actually, and certainly during the austerity period, we had to make some. In the case of the department, we cut the department by a third, and inevitably things like research and research base suffered. There's no getting away from it. And I share your view that we need to re-establish more systematically evidence, both before policies are introduced and after they're introduced. I think it needs to become recognised as a core thing that we do, and I don't think it is as consistently strong. I think if it was, we wouldn't see some of the things that come forward, because the evidence would clearly show that it wouldn't work. And somebody once said to me that I don't mind people making new mistakes, it's when they make the same mistakes that I get frustrated. And I think we would less often make the same mistakes if we followed the evidence across all government policy making, by the way. And there's a paper by a colleague of mine, Jonathan Slater, on this issue of policy making, which I would recommend if you're interested to have a read of, because I think you're quite right, evidence-based policy rather than policy-based evidence, I think is what we need. Okay, question here, and then behind, a lady here. And then if there's some more, oh yes, over here as well.
My name's Sheila Thomas. I wonder how do we arrest the decline in voter participation, and is this an indication of lack of interest or lack of travel?
Gosh, again, a big question really. And how much time have we got on this? I could give you lots of thoughts on this really. I have to say, just as a parting shot, I am worried about some of the provisions of the elections bill, which I think risk creating more issues about participation. I completely believe in the need to have a secure system, but we've got to also think about what we're doing by way of hurdles. But let's take the wider issue of trust. On the whole, people will vote if they think it will make a difference. That's the issue. And if they stop believing that their vote will change anything, then why will they vote, basically? I think that's a core issue. I am personally, I accept this will be, not everybody's view, a supporter of a proportional voting system, because I think it more often results in outcomes that reflect a broader base of view, and gives more reason why people who happen to be either Labour in a Conservative area or Conservative in a Labour area or Lib Dem in an area to feel that their vote might make a difference. So I think that's one issue. I think it goes also to the issue of trust as well. If you don't believe in government, you don't believe it can help, or if it's got your interest at heart, I think that's an issue as well. So I think we could do any number of changes to the mechanisms, but unless we face these core issue of people believing it's worth voting because it'll make a difference in their place as well as for them personally, I think we will see it at best languish where it is now, and at worst continue to decline, I think. We do know, of course, that where people have faced simple choices, their turnout has been high. So it isn't always the case that we've seen low turnouts, but I think, again, the underlying trend is a worry here. So I think it's about restoring the confidence that government can do things and make a difference to people's lives. I think it's restoring the sense in which people think their vote makes a difference, their individual vote. It's worth turning out to vote. Question behind.
Richard Morris, retired teacher. Going back to the lady's point here about accepting evidence before you make decisions. If in the longer term, I'm wondering whether we should change our educational system to emphasise more on training children to make their own decisions, to think for themselves, and dare I cite and say it as an ex-science teacher, emphasising the importance of evidence, which of course science is based on. And that should be one of the things that is emphasised in school education, which I don't think it is at the moment.
I think, again, I wouldn't claim to be an expert in the curriculum on this, so I couldn't say whether that's an issue, but I take your point, really. I would go a little bit further, though. I'd actually say encouraging debate and challenge is important there as well. I always had a difficulty with the mantra of follow the science, to say, because it made the presumption that there was one single scientific view that everybody would share that you had to follow. And of course, like everything, scientists disagree. And in fact, the whole scientific method relies on people disagreeing and debating, doesn't it? And so you end up having to make decisions across a range of views, but you've got to hear all those views. You've got to test them out and listen to them, and evidence has to be within a perspective of doubt, if you like, as well as acceptance. So I guess I would certainly support your view about the importance of teaching about evidence and its value, but I also would want to keep a sense in which debate and doubt form part of what we're looking for in our young people as well. There's a question behind you, I think. So where's the next? Over here, sorry, beg your pardon, we've been waiting quite a long time. And over here, I've not been very good at this actually. I want to be sacked if I was anything good at this. But I'll take a question here and then over on the right-hand side as well.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I'm a school pupil in Cheltenham, and my question is, do you think there is a difference in levels of trust between different generations, and if so, why do you think it is?
God, this question, I think I need to do another lecture for you. It's a serious and well-made question. There's a sociologist, Professor Bobby Duffy, who has written extensively on the issue of generational difference. And actually what he finds is that actually the differences are not half as big as people think they are. There is a conventional wisdom that says there are big differences between generations, attitudes to life and so on, the so-called Generation Y and Generation X. And he actually challenges that view. And so I'm not, whereas I would have given you a different answer a few years ago and said, yes, there is a difference and trust has probably fallen, and quoted some of the stats that were being quoted at me, I'm beginning to question that myself now, and actually I'm beginning to wonder whether we have kind of created this sense of generational differences when actually there's a lot more that unites generations than divides them. And I think Bobby Duffy has been, going back to the issue of doubt and debate, has changed my view on it. But what's your view? What's your thought?
I think it's very specific to the person. It's less of a generational effect, and I think it's more of the more factors that have more influence are sort of your upbringing, where you're from, your different experiences, education at different stages of your life. I think younger people tend to have more of a taste for wanting change and things like that, but not, that wouldn't apply, like you said, specifically to trust. But I think there is a difference. I agree with you in the sense that not in terms of trust.
I think that's a really good point you make, and I think socioeconomic differences are probably more powerful. Again, the analysis shows that those who predominantly voted for Donald Trump were lower socioeconomic groups and a lower proportion having degrees. And so the socioeconomic effects, I suspect, are, if anything, more important, really. I think you're right about that. I think there's a question over here.
Duncan Munro, I'm a local parish councillor. I was interested by your comment earlier on when you were talking about trust, that generally people trust local rather more than central. You have some data to show that. I would guess really since Margaret Thatcher took on some of the big metropolitan areas like Liverpool in the 80s, that whether it's been a Labour government, a coalition government or a Conservative government, there has been erosion away from local government towards central government. And breaking up of local government in areas like education and issues of funding and so on. I'm interested if you, from your experience, felt that we do need to devolve more back to local government. I have yet to see some good plans to do so. I'd like to see some good plans to do so. I was wondering if you have some good plans to do so.
Well, if I was in charge, I very definitely would have some good plans. But you're right to say it has been eroded over time. Again, it's not been one party, it's been more than one. Both the powers and the freedom and flexibilities to use those powers. And of course, the financial base has been a massive challenge to local government. It experienced, I think, by some margin, some of the biggest reductions in budgets during the austerity period. And I personally think we would be a better country with more devolution. And we've argued quite forcefully in the UK 2070 Commission. There's a lot of detail in that report about how devolution might happen. And if you wanted to see more, do have a look at the reports on the website of UK 2070. And actually, one of the interesting things is we are one of the most centralised countries, and we're also one of the most unequal. So centralism hasn't brought, one of the arguments about decentralisation is that you get a postcode lottery. Actually, we have a postcode lottery now with a very centralised system. So I'm a passionate believer in decentralising, but it has to be both powers and funding. It has to be both. I do actually feel that there have been some positive moves, and I think the combined authorities and the mayors are a good thing. I'm a supporter of them. I wouldn't say mayors are right for everywhere, but I do think they're right for major urban areas, and I think they have demonstrated they can have impact. I think Ben Houchin, for example, has had a big impact. Andy Burnham has, I could go on really. So there have been some things that have pushed against the tide, but the general direction has been towards more centralism, and we need to reverse that. And I think the Levelling Up White Paper starts that debate, actually. And again, if I refer to the OECD, what they found is that devolved countries don't necessarily have faster rates of growth, but they do find they have fairer rates of growth. That's interesting, isn't it, I think, in my view. So I'm a passionate devolver, and I would both devolve powers and funding if I had the opportunity. Question at the back and then over here.
Thanks so much. It's such a fascinating talk. My name is Matthew Lovett. I'm head of the music department here at the university. Just picking up on what you were saying about this 2070 context. I'm just curious, this question's kind of come up in different ways through the evening, but whether someone like Boris Johnson is maybe less a kind of agent of mistrust, but maybe more a symptom of a kind of wider structure that's kind of, in a sense, and this is the 2070 question, whether this is about a kind of teething issue, in a sense, that there are various things, if you think about, the Brexit vote. I live in South Wales, where the dual carriageways are covered with signs saying sponsored and funded by the EU, but there's such a disconnect between people's kind of feeling on the ground of trust in government. And so whether the Johnson issue actually is just part of a flow of information that's problematising trust, but actually is on a journey to a different form of understanding of trust, really.
Yes, I understand the question. It's a good one. And if you read the piece of work I referred to on British social attitudes, it's actually about the impact of Brexit on trust. In fact, if you read it, it's got an interesting piece. And there's no doubt Brexit was a very polarising issue, and therefore created some of those senses of, one camp distrusting the other and vice versa. So I absolutely get that point. And of course, one of the things that prompted us to do the Civic University Review was the disconnect between universities who are almost universally in the Remain camp and their communities who were very often in the Leave camp. That's a fact. And what did that say about the connectivity? Now, you might argue I might have not said anything, but it was certainly a point that was raised. So I think you're right, there are drivers of distrust like Brexit, and I don't mean that as a pro or anti-Brexit, by the way, I just think it's a fact. But I also feel, and I've come to this view, if you like, more lately than before. I used to work for Boris Johnson, actually, by the way, when he was a mayor, and I actually enjoyed working with him, in fact. It was huge fun, and he actually bounced along and dealt with things. But I'm afraid since 2019 I've changed my view, and I think he is an agent and not just a consequence of this distrust. I have to say that. I'm conscious there is a local MP here who won't agree, but I have to say it as I feel it, quite honestly. He did have a very, I will just give one anecdote that which sort of, I think, says well of him in a way. He once had to let go of one of his deputy mayors who got himself in a bit of a tangle. And that evening I was with him at an event, and he said, look, just remember, out of every disaster comes an opportunity. And then he paused and said, or in my case, an opportunity for another disaster. He might have said he had a self-knowing that he perhaps didn't realise, but I thought it was a good line, and I remembered his sense. But reluctantly, I feel, because, as I say, I've never been someone who's felt hostile to him as a person. I do feel he is an agent of some of the problems we face now. And he has to change and fundamentally change the way he approaches things, or he has to change, be moved. I feel that quite strongly. Over here is a question.
Hello, my name is Cahill. I'm a social worker here at Cheltenham. And I wanted to think actually about the media. You touched on it briefly, but I actually wonder, when it comes to trust in government, if the media and government can actually be separated, because the media has so much power, and I think the media alone could destabilise trust in the government or build it up. And even recently, when we're looking at Partygate, as much as I despise Boris, the media have severely focused on Boris and that, distracting from other issues such as rent increases, the cost of living increases. And if you look as well, you made an interesting point about having the media being free, and in theory I agree with that, but in practice what we're seeing is the media are not free. If you look at representation of each party, representation of each issue, that's not what they do. They're conglomerate controlled by a very small number of individual billionaires with their own political agenda as well. And so therefore want to challenge back at you, is like, well, does the free media really work? And as long as we have free media, can we even establish trust in our government whenever the media can demolish that really in very short notice?
Yeah, I take your point. I would have if I had a wish, I think we had a more diverse media with more diverse ownership. I think you're absolutely right. It has become, at least in some instances, a bit of a plaything of oligarchs, basically, and we don't have at this juncture, at least, a balanced media across the political spectrum. So all of that is true. But even though that's the case, I don't think it stopped papers who are genuinely of a right-wing inclination, like the Daily Mail, being very challenging and critical on issues like this. And you might ask, why do they do that? Well, because they follow what their readers are saying. They are very, very, whatever you think, they are acutely attuned to the mood of their readers. And yes, they'll have counter views from different commentators, but they set their agenda through their understanding. And I think, however frustrating it is to have the media we have, it's the best we've got, and we would be worse off without it, I think, is what I'm saying. And my bigger worry is that the kind of financial challenges they face will lead to a sort of dependency with government and we're already seeing it in the appointment of the number of special advisors and the number of photographers who essentially do celebrity photos of their ministers. I can put it bluntly, and that should stop. I think it's distancing and reminds the need to trust. I don't mean you should have ever any government photographers, but we now have the press kept away from politicians, and then official photographers tell the story, if you like, and I think that's unhealthy. I also worry about special advisors. If you think there are currently more special advisors in Downing Street now, just Downing Street, than there were across the whole of government when John Major was Prime Minister. I'm not against special advisors, they have a role to play, don't get me wrong, and I work very well with them. But I wonder kind of where this is going, actually. And so I worry more about that, if I'm honest, than I do about having a press that, on occasion, that plays that challenging role. I'd rather they were more challenging, to be honest, even if it's uncomfortable. Okay, I'm conscious of
There's one last question, and then I think probably we should wrap up.
It's always, and the last question is the zinger that you can possibly answer. So,
the last question. I'm Henry Olds. I spent about 30 years in local government. This county has 6 district councils and a county council. It has 7 administrative departments. It has 7 treasurer's departments. It has 320 council members. Isn't it about time we realise that a lot of our work has been centralised? We're doing half as much, but not half as much, a lot less work than we used to do 30 years ago. And it's about time we had a unitary county with fewer councillors, more important people, and better decision making, which was unified across all the districts. Now we're getting problems with one district putting houses on the boundary of another district, and warfare breaks out, and it is completely unproductive and very costly.
Right. Well, look, thank you for that question, but I think my prediction was right, actually. I've only worked for unitary government, but I have to say I am of the same view that we should have unitary government in this country. I have to say Eric was passionately opposed to this, to the point where even where the councils wanted to do it, he didn't want to do it, for a range of reasons I won't go into. But and I don't want to demean district councils, and I wouldn't say they're not important. I think there's some great districts and some great district councillors, actually, but I just think that local government works better at a single tier. And actually, if you want to take forward new agendas, the devolution agenda that I spoke about, the economic role, you have to have unitary government. It's just too difficult to do on 2 tiers. So what I'd say is just look at the places that have gone to single tier. Would any of them ever go back? No, they wouldn't. For me, it's a clear-cut case. And what you then do is, to avoid the remoteness, is you have local councils, like parish councils, local community councils, where people can be engaged in the most local issues. So you don't do away with that kind of activity, but it's a different thing, really. So I'm a believer in unitary government. I wasn't always popular for saying that as president of the LGA when I was, but I think that you're right. Basically, we've got to move in that direction, and I just hope as we move on that councils will see it that way as well. Okay.
Well, thank you. Well, what an amazing discussion. This could not have been more relevant, more timely, more important, as Bob has explained, and as John Major said in his speech, and that is well worth reading as well. This really is about the health of our democracy, and it matters hugely, because if we collectively lose trust in government, then we're going to undermine many of our chances for collective effort in making the country better. And if I could offer kind of one reflection, it was triggered by René's thought, and this is also about us. It's not just about them, because the critical point Bob made, trust is a relationship. One party bestows it on an individual or an organisation, or doesn't bestow it. And one of the things I'm really interested in is, as a nation, are we losing our willingness to trust right across the board? If you think over many, many years now, the number of sort of great public institutions where trust has steadily been eroded. We've got it going on with the police now, the BBC, universities arguably. And so there's something quite important, I think, about how all of us try to retain a willingness to trust where trust is earned. Because if we don't, if we just say a plague on all of your houses, if we ignore the fact that day after day there are government ministers, there are officials doing their best, trying hard, pursuing things that they believe in, and say, you know, to hell with a lot of you, then we will all disengage, and our chances of collectively working positively together for social good and economic good will be reduced. So I think this is really quite, you know, it's a crucial set of issues, but it is about all of us. It's not just about them, I think. Absolutely. But Bob, thank you hugely. That was really, really thought-provoking. Could I say thank you, obviously, to Bob, but also to everybody for coming, to René, our Chancellor, for presiding, and to Listra, to our students who have played such an important part in making all of the arrangements. So thank you to everybody, but particularly thank you to Bob for a wonderful, really thought-provoking and very timely lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.